In this video we're going to be looking at how to create a bouncing ball effect along a path, and we're going to utilize timing, slow in, slow out, and squash and stretch in order to do this. So I'm in Photoshop here and I've got a standard document set up. It's just 1280 by 720. That's a resolution I like to work with when I'm doing some animation. And what I'm going to do is utilize Photoshop's animation timeline here. So I'm going to go to my window menu and go down to timeline. And straight away you won't see much, but we're just going to create a video timeline by clicking on this button. And I'm not going to make use of video layers for this example. I'm going to layer everything up manually. So to begin with, what exactly are we trying to do? Well, essentially we're trying to get a ball that bounces across the screen. It's going to move from point A right through to point B, and it's going to do that in a motion similar to this. So we can use timing to set out our keys and figure out exactly how we want to set the timing to get this ball bounce going. So in order to do this, you'll notice that there are really a few factors that we have to think about. We've got the position where the ball starts at point A, and then we've got the position where the ball finishes at point B. And in between we've got these series of bounces, and so we've really got this downward motion here where the ball is effectively going to be speeding up, and it's doing that because it's got gravity that's acting on it. So two things are going to happen. Firstly, the ball is going to speed up, and secondly, the ball is going to change shape, because as gravity takes over, it's going to go from this kind of shape into this kind of shape. It's going to stretch, and we're going to exaggerate that during our animation. And when the ball hits the ground, of course, the ground is going to be an instant stopping force, and the ball is going to change shape, so it's kind of going to turn into this sort of thing. And we want to be very careful to pay attention to volume here. Now, I haven't really been doing that in these quick sketches, but if I have a ball that normally looks like this, when the ball is squashed, you want to imagine that the ball is essentially filled with some kind of solid, like a liquid or something like that. So if it occupies this much space normally, you want to make sure that it occupies the same sort of volume or area when it's squashed or stretched. And this is actually a little large, but hopefully you get the idea. So when the ball's hit the ground here, it's going to instantly bounce up, and it's going to do so very quickly, and then it's going to slow down. So you've got two different actions going on here. From here to here, the ball is going to speed up, and then from here to here, the ball is going to slow down. This first action where we have the ball going down and hitting the ground, this is going to be a speeding up action. So this would be a slow out, because we are slowing out of the first keyframe and speeding up as we continue. And then the second action, when we bounce and start to go back up and gravity takes over again, this is going to be a slow in, because we're slowing into the keyframe there. So we're slowing out of the first keyframe, and then we're slowing in to this keyframe here. So that's some things to think about: the speed, the timing, the squash, the stretch. So we've got a path, we've got an idea of exactly what we're trying to accomplish. How do we actually get started on this? Well, I'm going to delete my entire canvas here, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to temporarily set this to white, and that's going to be my background. I'm going to set a new layer, and I'm going to call this layer timing. I like to set up a timing layer so that I can essentially draw out what it is I'm trying to do, and I also draw my path of action on here as well, so I can really sort of gauge what it is that I'm trying to do here. I'm going to draw this in black, so I'm going to start here, make sure I'm on my timing layer, and I'm going to sort of replicate that initial bounce that I had before. Okay, it's not great, but it's close. And what's great about working on separate layers is that you can kind of tweak this and move it around and adjust it, and no one's going to see this except you, so don't worry about being messy. So we're going to come down here. Our ground plane is going to sit along here. Okay, so I'm going to move from A to B. So how do we figure out the timing of this? Well, we're going to use an old school timing diagram to do that, and they're incredibly useful and something you should really get your head around. And you want to start by thinking about where are your keys, where are your extremes? Well, first of all, we have one here, because that's where our motion is starting. So this point here, I'm going to mark off roughly where the center of the ball would be. This would be our first extreme. And when you think about it, the next extreme is going to be when it hits the ground here. I'm going to have an extreme there. And that essentially is the start of a motion and the stop of a motion. I'm going to start a new motion, and I'm going to put a key here, because we're essentially changing direction. We're moving up, we get to here, and we move down. This is going to be another key, and so on and so forth. So we just keep going through the motion. So we have our keys set out. How do we know how long this should take and what kind of timing we should assign to each of these keys? Well, first off, I'm going to be animating in 2s, and I'm going to be animating at 24 frames per second. So I have to draw 12 frames to get 1 full second of animation. So I'm going to set my frame rate here by going to the drop-down menu in the top right of the timeline palette, and I'm going to go to set frame rate. I'm going to change that to 24 frames per second. And ideally for this example, I would like this ball bounce from start to finish to take roughly 2 seconds. So that's what we're aiming for. So I'm going to make a note of that. 2 seconds, 24 frames per second. That's around 48 frames. Well, it is 48 frames. So we're going to try and get close to that. Now, we're animating in 2s. So we're going to essentially be setting our frames that we do on odd frames. It makes it so much easier. If I'm doing a timing diagram here, like this, and I go from 1 to 5, those would be my extremes or my keys. And then my breakdown here would be 3. And that leaves me very neatly with 2 in-betweens. There'd be 2 and 4. Now you can imagine if I went between 1 and 6, then the question becomes, well, what is the breakdown? Is it 3? And so what goes either side? Well, then we'd have 4 and 5, and then here we'd have 2, so we don't have equal spacing. So there's a reason that we're animating and we're setting our frames here to odd numbers, because we're working in 2s. So let me go ahead and just quickly undo this. So let me draw up my timing chart here. So I'm going to draw from here. I'm going to draw my chart across the top and down here, still on my timing layer. And I'm going to sort of try and figure out the spacing here. Now, what I like to do is just draw my timing diagram for this exercise just all together on one sheet, because we're not working on separate sheets of paper. So I do everything on the main timing diagram. So I'm going to do a line down here, and this is going to be my key here. And then I'm going to have my key here, here, and they're going to get smaller and to the end. So I'll do it to here, so I'll make a slight adjustment there. So obviously as the ball bounces, it loses energy and it really speeds up. And so we want to occupy less frames on these bounces to the right, so they happen faster, and more frames on the bounces on the left, so they happen slower. So with that in mind, you can see how, even just by looking at this chart here, how the frames get closer and closer as we near the end of the animation. So if this is going to be our extreme 1, then what I could say to begin with is that our next extreme or key as it bounces on the ground could be, let's say 11, keeping it odd. And we could have a breakdown right there, and halfway between that is essentially, well, it's going to be 6. Now you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, you said about using odd numbers and we're putting in an even number in there. And there's a reason for this. I don't want this to be equidistant. Because if you think about it, if I go ahead and do 5 and 7 either side, and then I did maybe 9 here, and I did 3 here, then really we're sort of doing equidistant spacing, so we'd animate 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, which is going to be linear timing, the most boring of all, really, in this case. So let me undo this and show you my plan of action. I want to try and get my easing action here, my slow out. We're slowing out of that initial frame. So I'm actually going to put frame 9 here, and this is going to be my breakdown. And then either side of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this in half again, and I'm going to put 7 here, that's my in-between. And then I'm going to put 5 here, and then I'm going to put 3 here. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and you can see that it's going to start off very, very slowly and speed up when these are played back at 24 frames per second. So just by looking at this timing chart, we can see exactly how this is going to animate. It's really, really useful. We can do the opposite as we come up the other side with a slight twist. What I've decided to do to get these to speed up, remember we need less frames on each of these bounces, is I'm going to plot out these keys beforehand. And what I'm going to do is essentially subtract a couple of frames each time. So if we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's a difference of 10. And then we did from here to here. Remember, this is a half bounce. This is a half bounce, half bounce, half bounce. So we want to think of that. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 would give me a difference of 8. So 2 less. So we'll do 19. And then if I do 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27 is also a difference of 8. That's going to be my next key. So we'll do 27. So we've got a difference of 10 here, and here we're going to have 8. Here we're going to have 8. And so you can kind of guess what's going to happen next with the pattern, right? 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33 for my next half bounce. It's going to be a difference of 6. And if we continue on, then this is going to be 39. Also 6. And then we're going to have 4 here, so this is going to be 43. And this one here is going to be 47. Difference of 4. So you can see how the bounce is going to speed up as we do this. And so that's kind of our 2 second there. So we're going to go to 47, we're going to hold it for 2s, and so it's essentially going to go frames 47 and frame 48. That's going to give us our 2 second of animation, which is what we specified down here earlier. So with that in mind, how do we go about dividing this up? Well, from 11 to 19, from here to here, which are my next 2 keys, I'm going to take the opposite principle because I want to be doing a slow in here. I'm going to slow into that where gravity takes over and the ball loses momentum. So I'm going to divide this down the center here, and I'm going to put frame 13 as my breakdown here. And so we can do the same thing. This is going to be 15 as my in-between here. And then we're going to have 17, so 1 less. It's going to be my in-between here. You can see that the ball starts at frame 1, it starts to speed up, hits the ground, and then starts to slow down as it gets to 19. And we can just keep on with this plan of attack. So from 19 to 27, we're going to go the opposite. We're going to go 25 as our breakdown, 23, and then we're going to have 21 here. And that gives us the same effect. We're going to slow out of frame 19 as we begin to get momentum again and hit at frame 27. Let me mark them down here so we just remember exactly what's going on. This is 11, this is 19, this is 27, 33, I'm circling them because they're extremes or keys, 39, 43, and then 47. So moving on, we'll just keep going like this. We're going to go from 27 to 33. So I'm going to put 29 here. 31 is going to be my in-between. do the opposite here. This is going to be 37. Do it down here, keep it consistent. This is going to be 35. And then 33. Always a difference of 2. We'll talk about switching to 1s later on. So 39, this is going to be here, this is going to be 41. This is going to be 43, so we're not even going to have an in-between here. This is going to be 45. So we're just doing breakdowns for these last. These ones are going to happen very quickly. So really we've got our whole timing chart laid out there, and you can essentially see how this is going to work. And if you wanted to make the ball bouncing last longer, you can simply put in a longer range of frames, and you can just start off, get your first bounce the timing that you want, and then just adjust the other ones as necessary. I kind of just figured this out and decided what would give me a nice timing without having to do too many drawings for this example. So next we're going to move on, and we're going to actually start plotting these out. So let's do that. I'm going to insert my initial keyframe here. I'm going to call this key 1 or K1, and I'm going to make this, if I right click, red. I like to color code all of my layers so that it's so much easier to see them once you start stacking them all up. We're going to get lots of layers going on here, and I'm going to bring this up here a little bit so I can sort of see what's going on. And what I like to do is draw in blue on these layers here. Let's get my size correct. That'll work. Okay. So at this point, what we have to do is decide exactly how much duration K1 should take. And so by default, Photoshop does what it always does, and it gives you 4 seconds on your first frame. So I'm going to take this right back. I want this to be 2 frames. Let me zoom in. And so we're working on 2, so we hold each drawing for 2 frames. And that's the beauty of using this method. And I always like to start from frame 1. I don't want to start from frame 0 because it just gets really confusing. So I'm going to go from 1 here, and obviously we finish on frame 47, but we hold it for frames 47 and 48. So our animation is effectively going to go to the start of frame 49. So take it to here, and then zoom in, and we got our whole timeline plotted out there. Okay, very good. So with that in mind, what I'm going to be doing is just duplicating layers as I go along through this. So I think what I'll do is I'll actually set up a sort of a template layer that I like to use. If I just keep creating new layers, then every new layer I create gives me that 4 seconds, which is really annoying. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this key 1, right click, duplicate layer, and I'm going to call this maybe just temp or template, and OK, and I'll just set this back to no color, and I can just duplicate this layer every time I want a new layer. So let's start. Key 1, got my timer here on the timeline, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the correct layer. I'm just going to draw out my first rough ball shape, something like this. And the beauty of working on layers is you can move these around. I'm just holding down Control, just moving it into place. Okay, so it's not great, but it's good enough, I think, for this. So just sort of solidify that a bit more. So this is key 1, and what I can now do is sort of plan to draw these out down this path of action here. In fact, what I'm going to do is come back to my timing layer temporarily, and I'm going to sort of mimic this timing effect on my arches here. So 9 is technically halfway, but I'm going to just move it down a bit. I'm going to put 9 here. This is my breakdown, and halfway I'm going to do 7, and halfway I'm going to do 5, and halfway I'm going to do 3. And that's really useful as you're plotting these drawings out. Do the same in reverse. Do 13, so your breakdown. Do 15, in between, 17, in between. And just work in that fashion. So 25. The great thing about this is you have this wonderful plan of action as you go. And really, working digitally, you have the freedom to move and adjust your keyframes. You've got so much more freedom than the traditional animators that didn't have that luxury, and they had to get their dope sheets or their exposure sheets perfectly right before they even began animating. Otherwise, they do loads of drawings and then they'd go ahead and expose all of them, and then they run into troubles very quickly. So let's do that there. That'll be 31. We'll come here and we'll do this here, something like that, and that. This will be 39, so this will be 37. This will be 35. And then here we'll have something like, make it move a bit faster, so I'll put it here. And we'll do 41. And here we'll do 45. And we're all set up, ready to go. So, back to K1. So from here, I want to get my next key set up. And so that really is going to be frame or key 11 here. And that's where the ball is going to be squashed. So I'm going to duplicate my temp layer. And I'm going to call this key 11 or K11. And I'm going to make this red because it's another key. And I'll put it above that. I keep my lower ones at the bottom. And then I'm going to sort of sketch in what this ball might look like when it hits the ground. So maybe something like this. Maybe that's a little bit on the large side, so we've got the luxury of Photoshop here. I'm going to do Command T, hold Shift, hold Alt, and I'm just going to shrink it down a little bit. Put it sort of here. Enter. So that might be what my ball looks like when it gets squashed. You can always tweak this, adjust it, change the size of it, just like I did. And right now it's at frame 1 on my timeline. So I want to drag this out to 11 here. Let me zoom in a bit so we can see those numbers. So this is going to be 11. Hold it for 2 frames. Alright, very good. Make sure that's correct. Yes. So we got frame 1, key 1, and then key 11. It'd be really nice to be able to see both of those at the same time when you start drawing the frames in between. So let's turn on onion skinning. Go to our panel options here, go to onion skin settings, and I like to just max these out. I just do 8 and 8. I'm going to look at 8 frames before and 8 frames after the current frame. So if I scrub this to halfway between, you can see how we get this nice opacity effect, and halfway between we can actually see both of these. So what might this ball look like when it is falling down here, when it's in breakdown 9? Well, let's go ahead and make a duplicate of our temp layer. Just duplicate that. This is going to be breakdown 9, so I'll do BD9, and I usually color these green and put that above 1 and drag that out to frame 9, which is here. So when the ball is falling, I'd probably want it to look like the squashed ball, but in the direction it's traveling. So make sure I'm on the correct layer, correct frame, and it might look something like this. It's being extreme here, it's being stretched. We're really sort of overemphasizing this. So, not bad. Now we can go ahead and do 3, 5, and 7. Now, the beauty of this is, if we go to frame 7, I'm going to duplicate my temp layer. I'm going to call this IB7 for in-between 7, and I usually color my in-betweens blue. And move it to 7. And then the ball essentially is going to be a little less distorted because it's picking up speed as it goes. So it might look something like this. And if you don't like what you've done, you can either delete it and try again, or you can just use the transform tool and just tweak it. It's not really round, but we'll just go with it. Frames 3 and 5, it won't really have picked up much distortion. In fact, let me just squash this down a little bit. It's a little big. Frames 3 and 5, it won't really have picked up much distortion. So I'm actually just going to duplicate key 1 and just cheat really and just copy this out. This will be IB5, we'll start with that one. In between 5, make it blue. And then I'm going to simply put that at frame 5, hold control, and I'm going to move it. You've got to be careful with your onion skinning. It tends to give you glitchy results sometimes, but when you let go, it all comes back. There we go. So I just essentially copied the first frame and put it to 5, and I'll do the same thing. I'm going to copy 5, and this is going to be IB3. So IB3 is here, it should sit below IB5, and I'm just going to move it with that center point where we put it in our timing diagram. So you get a really nice idea of the flow. You get the stair-stepping effect on your timeline, and you get the onion skinning there. So, just doing the digital equivalent of a roll or flipping, just dragging that timeline. I can turn off onion skinning to sort of get an idea of how that's going to animate. Alright, and if I hit space, and in fact what I'm going to do is just temporarily shorten my preview area. If I hit space, get rid of that empty first frame, you can see that the ball sort of starts to speed up. Now, we'll talk about the fact that it's not very convincing between 9 and 11. We'll talk about that in a bit, but first of all, let's go the other direction. Let's go from 11 to 19, and we'll just keep going. So when my ball reaches frame 19, or key 19, essentially it's going to look like it does here. It's going to have slowed right down again and regained its regular shape. So why don't we just go ahead and duplicate K1 or key 1, duplicate layer. This becomes key 19. Move it up, move it out to 19, move it across, something like that. Let's put our onion skinning back on temporarily. Onion skins. Alright, very cool. So 13 is going to essentially be very similar to 9. So we could go ahead and copy that breakdown layer 9, duplicate. So this is going to be breakdown 13. Move it to frame 13 and move it up. And move it across. And I'm just going to use my Control T, move it across. Perhaps it's not quite as exaggerated, so we could kind of squash it down a bit. It's gradually losing its energy as it gets moved. And that timing diagram, the timing that I sketched out on these curves is only a guide, so don't feel like it's law. Okay, and we're going to duplicate 19, and we're going to replicate that at frames, or in betweens 15 and 17, so let me duplicate that. Duplicate layer, 15, move it underneath 19, it's going to be blue because it's an in-between, and we'll put it at 15, move it to there, same thing, and it's going to become 17, blue, would probably help if I actually duplicated it correctly, there we go, and move that to 17, and so on and so forth. So you hopefully you get the idea. You can see how this is starting to build up, and you're getting, a fairly convincing effect here as we tweak that down a bit, as we sort of build this up, and you can see how that slow out to the slow in has an effect on the spacing. So the timing, remember, is between your keyframes. That's the overall timing, but the spacing determines the speed and how that speed changes. Now, before I go in and talk about finishing this off, I want to talk to you about what tends to happen with the persistence of vision, or this phi phenomenon, where you perceive moving graphics as movement, or the eye does. Now the problem is, between breakdown 9 and key 11, there's a lot more movement here. So you'll tend to find that the movement's more convincing where the spheres overlap. It becomes less convincing when you get a big jump. So between 9 and 11, 11 and 13, there's a big jump. So here's what really you'll find happening in a lot of animation, is that they'll temporarily switch to ones, and they'll draw in the in-between frames. So draw in frames 10 and 12, and that makes the effect a little more convincing. It makes the eye believe it. Because remember, animating in twos is a shortcut. It's a time saver, and if that ruins the effect, then you're going to have to temporarily switch back to animating in ones. So let's take a copy of 9, and what we'll do is, and I'll mark this on my timing diagram so that we know exactly what's going on. I'm going to add in a frame. Oh, that's in the wrong spot. I'm going to add in a frame here. This is going to be on ones, and it's going to be 10. And I'm going to add in a frame here, and it's going to be 12. And that hopefully will make it a little bit more convincing. So let's come back to 9, duplicate that. And this is going to become in between 10. So IB 10. We're working on ones. Why don't we give it a slightly different color? Let's give it an orange just to be different, and we'll put it above 9, which is where it is. And now essentially we can just move this to where we think that might be, so where we're getting some overlap. So let me Command T this, keep it on that arc. So I would say somewhere like that. We might even get a bit more stretch going on, but I think for now that'll work. Now we have to correct our timeline, because we're still working in twos, so essentially frames 9 and 10 are overlapping here. So if I take frame 9, that now becomes 1 frame. Frame 10 holds for 1 frame. And then we're going to create frame 12, and then we leave a spot for 12, which we're going to draw in here, which we're also going to hold for 1. So you have to tweak and adjust your timeline here. So I'm going to copy frame 13, break down 13, duplicate the layer. That's going to become IB12. Again, I'll make it orange just so we can really see what's going on here. It just gets really confusing if they're all the same color, I find. Bring that down. Move it into position. Frame 12, we're holding it for 1. Come to here. Control T and bring that down to sort of, again, where it's overlapping. Just rotate it a little bit. Use the arrow keys just to nudge it. Something like that. So now you can start to see, especially if I turn off onion skinning, what's going on here. So the ball speeds up, switches to ones, and this is a little bit more convincing now where it hits the ground, because we've switched to ones. Now the only other way to make that even more convincing would either be to animate at a higher frame rate or to slow down the action. Other than that, we're pretty much as good as we can get there, sticking with twos and ones. So that's that first cycle, that slow out and slow in. It's exactly the same procedure as you move from the rest of the frames. And rather than show you all that repetition in this video, I'm just going to load up one that I created earlier. And that one is right here. So I took exactly the same concept. So we bounce down, slow in, slow out, slow in, slow out. And sticking to your timing diagram, everything should be pretty much peachy, and you should be good to go. The only difference on this one, if I hide my timing diagram and take off onion skinning, what I did was I added a little shadow, and I just duplicated that across for most of these drawings, just to give it a bit of grounding so you can get an idea of height, exactly how high off the ground that is. So if we space to play this back, we've got a fairly convincing ball bounce. And then what you could do is you could go ahead, and what I like to typically do is essentially add a new layer above each of these, and those become my clean layers. And I essentially ink them in or fill out those shapes and create something cleaner. So the blue is just for a temporary guide, and then I usually come over with black on a new layer to clean that up. So in a nutshell, that is creating a ball bounce along a path using arcs, timing, spacing for your slow-ins and slow-outs, and also squash and stretch, and being very cautious to maintain volume. So thanks for watching.